Hi, everyone, and welcome to this side event. The Green Wave hits Europe, recent cannabis regulation initiative in Europe. This event is sponsored by Forum Droghe, Associazione Luca Coscioni, ECHERS, IDPC, Relief Malta, TNI, Transform, and the Washington Office on Latin America. I am Susanna Ronconi by Forum Droghe, and I will coordinate this discussion. During this event, we will discuss and compare the different models of regulation of recreational cannabis that have been proposed and in some cases have been approved in Europe. We know that the reform of cannabis policies is going on in Europe too, with different outcomes. We know, for instance, that Malta have already partially decriminalized personal use and cultivation. And we know that in other countries, like in Luxembourg, Germany, Italy, and other countries too, the reform of cannabis policies are on the political agenda. So things are going on, and I think that is very interesting for all of us to understand the different legal models that are going to be discussed. And another, I think, very important issues to discuss now is if, how, and to what extent these legal models are or are not in accordance with the International Convention on Drugs and with the legal European frameworks. So we are going to discuss all this, and thanks to our three speakers that we help us in this discussion. And only want to remind who is following us that it is possible to make questions in the question and answer area. And I remind also our kind speakers that they have a maximum time of 10, 12 minutes for their speech, and then there will be the possibility to take the floor again during the answer and question sessions. So let's start with Andrew Bonello. Welcome, Andrew, from Relief Malta, that is an NGO working for the drug policy reform and cannabis policy reforms. And we ask Andrew to describe, to illustrate the new Maltese law on cannabis and the discussion about this new law. Please, Andrew.
Thank you, Susanna, and good day to everybody. As everybody knows, Malta seems to be on the tip of a lot of people's tongues when it comes to cannabis reform, especially in Europe. I could say that we are probably the first movers. So it's very exciting times for the Maltese at the moment. We had a law which came out last December, a law which is basically entitled the Authority on the Responsible Use of Cannabis and to amend various laws at certain cannabis activities. This has been, of course, heralded by many international experts as a very positive development. This law is following another law which came out in 2015, which was basically depenalizing as very small amounts of drug possession. So what we see in this new law is a kind of mix between depenalization, decriminalization, and criminalization, with, of course, the police still retaining the rights to arrest you if there is any suspicion of trafficking, which is particularly tricky because we still don't understand exactly how the police can consider a person a trafficker, even if they're caught in possession of very small amounts. Sometimes they might look at you and see that if your amounts are in different bags, or if there is a weighing scale anywhere involved, these can unfortunately still get you into a lot of trouble. We're seeing as well that there seems to be some discrepancies with CBD flower, which is still considered to be a narcotic by the police. We've had people arrested because they don't understand that the flower actually has low percentages of THC, under 0.2%. So, you know, sending it off to get tested, and people are still being kept overnight, sometimes strip searched. So, you know, there are a lot of things that need to be ironed out still. Obviously, it's a period of where the law came into effect. And as we see in multiple jurisdictions, there is always a period of uncertainty after these things happen. People are not too sure about how the law is actually working. Sometimes these laws do come out in a lot of legalese language, so not too many people are understanding the fine detail. Unfortunately, our new law still reflects discriminatory practices which continue to inflict harm on cannabis consumers. So we find that there are still some pressing matters that needs to be addressed. Of course, one of them is the continued practice of law enforcement, which still criminalize the act of sharing cannabis. This can get you prosecuted for something known as trafficking by sharing, which unfortunately is still going on today. We're also seeing that in this law there is a lack of social equity approach, which is meant to remedy the wrongdoings of the past. And we find this is very important for any reform, to lay the foundations to be able to build better policies upon. This is something that authorities need to keep in mind, not brush off. And without social equity approach, I think that it will be very difficult to go forward without future problems arising. Of course, also there is the low threshold that one is permitted to possess, both on the person and in the household, because this is still contributing to criminalizing the person and also pushes increased consumption. And of course, the complete ban on the consumption within the associations and other designated places, which unfortunately hinder the role of a communal approach, which is based on harm reduction principles. Yes, we do have associations that will be set up. That was mentioned in the new law. People might think more of cannabis social clubs. So the new law will be addressing how consumers can acquire the cannabis safely without having to go to the black market. And they've done this by designing a way, well, basically having associations which would be allowed to have up to 500 members, and these members will be able to purchase their cannabis from these associations, but then will have to go home to be able to consume. So we see that this leaves a few problems, of course, especially, you know, like I said before, sharing consuming only at home can lead to, you know, further use and further problems. So there are things, of course, other things we feel that are in need of urgent attention, which is something we will be proposing, which is the possibility to be sharing cannabis at no cost, which will give consumers the tools to steer away from the illicit market and further strengthen dialogue between cannabis and cannabis consuming peers. We will also be proposing that a creation of a safe space which allows consumption on site or in other designated venues, which will be only accessible to members, therefore fulfilling the core principles founded on harm reduction. And also offering a community approach acting as a safety net. It will also be beneficial because you will have also a hub for a educational exchange, which will also be a way to promote a healthier approach to cannabis consumption. One thing that we are worried about as well is we need a reassurance from how the police will be interpreting this new law. Therefore, the alignment between the de jure and the de facto implementation of the law. We're still seeing people getting arrested to this very day. So there are some things we see that needs to be, of course, updated as soon as possible, and we'll be pressing on this. But I think overall, we are definitely moving in the right direction. It's been a great step forward. We mentioned that it was a bold decision from the government to actually move forward with cannabis associations, and of course, you know, a limited amount of possession, which will act as protection towards cannabis consumers. Of course, one thing I haven't mentioned, which is probably the most important part of the law, is that the expungement of criminal records has been included. Therefore, people that are either awaiting a court case, or have some sort of tarnish on the police record will be able to have that cleaned. Of course, if it falls within the new parameters of the law. So that's something that's very important. We feel that's going to help a lot of people. And we hope that in the future, when these associations do form, a social equity approach will be implemented. Therefore, helping people that have been so badly affected by the past policies, this will help them maybe even get involved in this new cannabis setup. We feel that on the whole, like I said, this is a very good step forward. That it leaves room for improvement, but I think we are on the right track. The Cannabis Authority has just been set up a few months ago, so I don't think we should be putting too much pressure on them. They have a big task ahead, one of forming, trying to put together ways in which and parameters in which these associations can operate. I think that the new CEO of the Cannabis Authority is doing a good job, where she has our full support, and we will continue to dialogue not only with the authority but also with government entities that will fall under what this reform is about. So that's basically a brief update on what's happening in Malta. So I'd just like to give you back the mic, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the very clear explanation, for stressing lights and shadows, and from telling us that having a new law is only a first step. Then we have to follow and to monitoring the implementation of the law. Thank you so much. Now is the turn of Costanza Sanchez by ICERS, International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service. And we ask to Costanza to make an overview on recent cannabis regulation initiatives in Europe. Please, Costanza, thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this side event so early in the morning. And well, as Andrew has explained in detail, the most important political steps toward the regulation of cannabis for adult use has taken place in Malta last year. However, other relevant political steps also happen in other European countries. And I will now briefly explain provide an overview on the cases of Germany, Luxembourg, Italy, and Spain. And after that, I will share a few considerations on the inclusion of the principles of social justice in the transition from cannabis prohibition to regulated markets. Well, starting with the national developments, in Germany, the new government that emerged from the September elections, the so-called traffic light coalition, included in the coalition agreement a fully regulated recreational market for adult users through the controlled supply in licensed stores. The objectives of the coalitions were to ensure the health protection of consumers by the introduction of a set of quality controls and to protect young people. It also includes a very interesting point, in my point of view, which is an evaluation plan after 4 years of implementations to make an assessment of the social impact of this policy and to introduce the necessary adjustments once we know the results of this evaluation. According to local experts, drafting the bill and obtaining the majority at the Bundestag, the parliament, the German parliament, may take some time, but seems to be feasible. But the passing of the law also requires the approval of the Bundesrat, which is the Federal Council, which represents the German states, and this seems more complicated as the Federal Council nowadays is controlled by the Conservatives, the CDU, that has blocked similar plans in the past. Well, the details of this regulation, as far as I know, are not, if ready, are not public yet. But this is creating great expectations because of the size of Germany, which is the European Union's leading economy with more than 80 people. And this makes this plan really attractive for the attentions of many stakeholders. In the case of Luxembourg, which is a more modest scale country, the path followed was somehow similar. The coalition agreement that came from the election of 2018 also included the development of recreational cannabis legislation. In this agreement, the objectives were specified. They were to decriminalize and literally say, or even legalize under conditions to be defined, the production on national territory, as well as the purchase, possession, and consumption of recreational cannabis for the personal needs of adult residents. This is really important, residents. On October 21, the government presented the so-called packages of measures regarding the problem of drug-related crime, which included an update on the progress of this system of controlled supply through legal sales to residents. This note had two parts. First, the home cultivation of cannabis up to 4 plants per household that will be permitted, but limiting the place of cultivation to the usual place of residence and maintaining the ban on consuming in public. And second, there will be lower penalties for offenses of consumption, possession, transport in public, and acquisition when the quantity of cannabis doesn't exceed 3 grams. So this initiative is expected to be considered by the Luxembourg Chamber of Deputies in the coming months. I don't have a date, probably, I don't know, maybe you have, but the government justifies the delay due to the pandemic, as well as international constraints and diplomatic relations that I think Tom is commenting on his presentation, these international constraints. On the other hand, in Italy, initiatives coming from civil society has been particularly crucial for the push of cannabis regulations. And last summer, over 600,000 people signed a request for a referendum, which aims to decriminalize the cultivation of cannabis for personal use and cancel prison sentences for soft drugs, as well as the sanction of withdrawal or suspension of driving license for users of all substances. The Italian Constitutional Court decided that the referendum was inadmissible, and this decision, the decision of the Constitutional Court, refers to possible violations of the obligation of the international conventions and also the European Council decision of 2004, ignoring the legal motivations and the sign of the referendum prepared by the promoters. Although very difficult, the group of promoters are appealing this decision. And in the meantime, they have dropped the text of a European Citizens Initiative on cannabis to relaunch this issue at the European, more continental level. And this is something that maybe our Italian colleagues now here can comment on the question and answer sections. Also, in the Italian Parliament, a popular initiative law for legal regulation of cannabis endorsed by 70,000 people in 2016 was never taken into consideration, as well as several other parliamentary initiatives. But these days, a more limited reforms will reach the plenary of the lower chamber with a proposal to decriminalize the cultivation of up to 4 female plants, to reduce the penalties for minor facts, distinguishing them from different substances, and to eliminate administrative sanctions for cannabis users. The current term will end in February 23, and the composition of the Senate is more conservative than the chamber, but leaders of the major parties that support the government have expressed their support to this reform. So this is still to see. Finally, I will comment on recent developments in Spain, where I'm speaking from, and whose process I've been following more closely, as you know. And several years ago, here in Spain, we had an intense political activity on cannabis, with the discussion of regional laws regulating cannabis social clubs, which is like the hot topic here in terms of cannabis regulations. Several regional laws were approved but rejected by the Constitutional Court, and after that we experienced some years without relevant progress. But last fall, in September 21, with regards to recreational adult use cannabis regulations, 3 bills were registered by 3 different parties, all of them left-wing parties. One of these bills was discussed and submitted to consideration to the plenary of the Congress without obtaining sufficient support to continue the procedures, basically due to the votes against of the right-wing parties, but also the socialist parties, which is the majority party of the government coalition. One of these drafts has more options, although limited, to be proceeded. This is the one submitted by Unidas Podemos, which is the other partner of the government coalitions. And this bill is the most ambitious in terms of the scope of the regulatory model they proposed. They propose it's very detailed on the regulation that they propose in terms of access to cannabis, includes different models of cannabis users associations, licenses for the entire production and distribution chain, and self-cultivations. The social debate around it has been really intense. It's been welcome, but also criticized from both who oppose to any type of regulation, but also from those who consider that several issues, especially cannabis users associations, should be regulated in a different way. So, as we were saying before, Europe is somehow the country or the continent of the about to happen. So, well, finally we have Malta, but anything else is somehow about to happen. And I would like to now to share some reflections on regarding the inclusion of social justice, the principles of social justice in these regulations proposals. And as we see, and this is not only in Spain, but in all European countries, the more cannabis becomes an issue on the political agenda, the more intense becomes the debate on how regulation should be, of course. But even this debate is very intense, even within the diverse stakeholders that support regulation. These social and political debates are about which issues should be considered priorities, should be addressed first, and notably, from my point of view, what should be the role of the state and the civil society as opposed to the weight of the free market. In Malta, as Andrew explained, these issues has been somehow addressed by designing a model in which commercial access to cannabis is not contemplated, at least for now. And rather the intention of the Maltese law, and Andrew, you can correct me if you want after, but is to launch a social and non-profit model with the inclusion and the participation of civil society, and also envisioning very interesting initiatives like creating this grievance board that you are planning, in which people particularly affected by criminalization could expose their situations and find paths to reparation. This is crucial for the inclusion of these principles of social justice. Well, these are all very relevant issues when it comes to the design of these more inclusive regulations. I will conclude with just a few thoughts. First of all, I think it's necessary to make a diagnosis of the states of cannabis markets in Europe from a social perspective. I mean, we need to connect cannabis regulation with the processes of social exclusion and structural inequalities produced by prohibition and suffered by part of the social sectors involved in illicit cannabis cultivation and trade. I believe it's necessary or important to identify who they are, what the situation is, what they think of regulation, what role they want to play in a regulated market. So a more inclusive perspective. Because regulatory proposals, I think they must go beyond the regulating a market or bringing to the surface a market. They must be a vehicle for social inclusion, since prohibition has been a catalyst for social exclusion. So also, I think it's essential to differentiate between advocacy and lobby. Well, I mean, between the sector that supports cannabis regulations in defense of public and social interest, and between those sectors that are more focused on the defense of private and particular interest. Both are legitimate, but particular interests should be identified as such. And I think the decisions on the regulatory model that will end up being implemented in each country are closely related to the dialectic between these two large groups, which are heterogeneous among themselves, but also, as I mentioned before, within themselves. And finally, to conclude, I would just say that this transition to regulated markets raises many concerns, of course, and will involve decisions that are not easy to make. But in my opinion, the most important one is whether we want cannabis regulation to be focused on life, care, users' rights, and social justice for the most vulnerable, or simply to bring a market to the surface. I think that if we are able to build a model as opposed to this prohibition, which has been opaque, imposed, punitive, we are able to build a model of regulation which is transparent, which is participatory and restorative, that would be a real green wave for Europe. So now I'm done. So thank you very much, Susanna.
Okay, Costanza, thank you so much for this overview. We see that Europe is going on, but we see also very differences among models. And I thank you for stressing the issues of social equity and justice that, in my opinion, is very important when we discuss the model we adopt. And also the issues of the models of regulating the market I think it's very, very important. So now we ask to Thomas Blickman to clarify the very difficult topics about if and how all these legal model of this law are or are not in accordance with the international framework and also with the specific European legal frameworks. Thanks, Thomas. We can't hear you, Tom. Your microphone.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Susanna, and Forum Droga, and especially Leonardo for organizing this. Yes, the consequences for the international framework are, of course, it's a very complicated issue, but yeah, we're stuck with conventions that are more than 60 years old right now, and that basically limit cannabis exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. But first, some remarks on international law. I think what we now see, the unprovoked and unjustified aggression of Russia against the Ukraine in violation of international law only underlines the importance of international law as one of the main instruments for a peaceful international relations. And in the past, too many times I've heard fellow drug policy reformers say that we should just ignore the UN drug control conventions as it does not allow for the legal regulation of recreational cannabis. And unfortunately, we also see now that countries that have actually regulated recreational cannabis also have not taken steps yet to address the issue. And now we see Russia condemning those countries to undermine international law. That's deplorable and hypocrite, but we have warned many times that not addressing the issue would make legalizing countries very vulnerable for this accusation. So, and while I agree that the UN drug control treaties are outdated and not fit for purpose, I strongly disagree that ignoring them is the right solution. International law is fragile, but an important construction, and ignoring it, well, that will hurt us all. That's why TNI and with our partners like the Global Drug Policy Observatory and Washington Office on Latin America have repeatedly organized side events here at the CND and have presented our research on how to find a way to implement reform and legally regulate cannabis in compliance with mechanisms, rules, and regulations of international law. We have outlined several options. One of them is amending the conventions. It would be the royal way to do it, but that's under the present conditions with conflicting views at the global level, and that will be a diplomatic nightmare and practically impossible. You can also simply withdraw from the conventions, but that would have serious consequences for the country involved. Being a state party to all the three drug control conventions is a condition for a lot of preferential trade agreements, for instance, or also for accession to the European Union. So there are two more realistic options. One is withdrawing from the 1961 single convention, followed by reaccession with a specific reservation regarding cannabis, which is recognized as a legitimate procedure. This procedure was used by Bolivia regarding the traditional use of coca leaves and was accepted. Bolivia initially tried to amend the treaties, but that was blocked by a number of objections. At the time of reaccession, 18 countries, including every member of the G8, submitted formal objections to Bolivia's reaccession, but that number was fell far short of the 62 objections you need to block such a reaccession. And among those countries that objected were the United States, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands, for instance, also Mexico, which, with the benefit of hindsight, might now regret that the objection to their objection at the time, as it now can potentially be used to allow for the legal regulation of cannabis. That said, it's quite easy to withdraw that objection by writing an official letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, as one of the objectives Mexico has already done. To strengthen a withdrawal and reaccession procedure, the reaccession with the reservation, it could also be done by a group of like-minded countries. And that group, as we see now, continues to grow Uruguay, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Malta, and probably more to follow in the coming years. And hopefully also countries from that traditionally produce cannabis, because in such a setup, then there would be a possibility to import and export cannabis. But the fourth option, and in our opinion, the best one, is a procedure for treaty, the inter se procedure for treaty modification. That is something that is in another treaty, in the it's Article 41 of the 1969 Vienna Convention law on law of treaties. And that procedure is in fact specifically designed to find a balance between treaty regime stability and on the one hand, and the need for change in absence of consensus. So the big advantage of that procedure is that you do that outside the conventions, the UN drug control conventions, and you can just form a group of like-minded countries and take that step and inform the other ones. But what you do only is valid between the countries that are part of that like-minded group. So you have to maintain your obligations to the other parties of in the convention of which you still are a part. I will now, the developments among EU member states also puts the spotlight on EU legislation regarding cannabis, and that became very clear when the Luxembourg's Minister of Justice confirmed in October 2021 that although full regulation of cannabis was still planned, it was temporarily postponed due to, among other things, legal obstacles at the European level. And that biggest obstacle is the framework decision 2004/757/GHA, laying down minimum provisions on the constituent elements of criminal acts and penalties in the field of illicit drug trafficking, which stipulates in Article 2.1, paragraph 1, that each member shall take the necessary measures to ensure that cultivation of opium poppy, coca bush, or the cannabis plants, and a number of other intentional acts such as selling and possessing, should be punishable when committed without right, as they say. It's not very clear what is meant by that, but the reasoning that if a country regulates recreational cannabis by law, by national law, it will be within right, and that sounds very appealing, but it ignores the fact that all EU countries also ratified the UN conventions, and this is even a precondition within the European Union, in which legal regulation of recreational cannabis is not allowed, of course, but must be limited to exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. In other words, to claim that the regulation of recreational cannabis would not be allowed by national law, EU countries first need to address the prohibition of recreational cannabis enshrined in the UN treaties. The correlation between the UN conventions and EU legislation is something that can not be untangled easily, but we have seen in the German, the bill proposed by the German Green Party, which was rejected, by the way, by the Bundestag 3 years ago. They tried to address that issue already, and since that rejected bill very much covers the intended reform by the new German government, it is to be expected that the reasoning on the compatibility with UN drug conventions and European law will be followed by the current government. The bill rightly states that there is a little doubt that the system such as the Cannabis Control Act, the Greens, which which allows cannabis to be sold in licensed outlets for adult recreational consumption, is not compatible with the international prohibition regime. And then it proposes to resolve the issue following more or less the example of Bolivia, so withdrawal and reaccession with a reservation, and then also address the issue with the 2004 framework decision in the EU, because that would take away the obstacle of the national law being without right. An important difference between the UN drug control conventions and EU legislation is that formal complaints, procedures, and sanction mechanism have a much stronger basis under EU law. For instance, the Article 40 procedure of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs at the UN, is kind of a nuclear option, and it's also a very lengthy process, and it has not been used to in the case of cannabis in practice. You have to go, it can lead to a dispute for the International Court of Justice. It's an option available, but it's not considered. It has not been considered for countries that are deemed by the INCB to be out of league with the conventions. In the EU, though, the effective application and implementation is a responsibility by to the European Commission, and in comparison with the INCB, the European Commission can more easily initiate infringement procedures following complaints about compliance with EU law from other UN member states, or even from citizens or businesses or other stakeholders. Such complaints can also more easily lead to a dispute procedure at the Luxembourg Court of Justice of the European Union, and ultimately to the possibility of economic sanctions or fines to force member states to comply with EU law. We see that happening in other areas, for instance, in Poland and the rule of law issue. So there's a very, much more easy way to impose sanctions on countries that do not comply with EU law. That said, the European Commission never initiated an infringement procedure against the Netherlands for its coffee shop system, but you can doubt if that falls within the European framework. But yeah, for that reason, the Netherlands argued strongly in favor of an exception under Article 2.2 of the framework decision for the behavior of those involved that was exclusively intended to provide for their personal use as defined by national law. So on issues of personal consumption, possession for personal consumption, cultivation for personal consumption, there is no common framework in the EU, and that is basically left to the discretion of each individual member state. But where
Sorry, Tom, you have to conclude because we have few minutes.
Yeah, okay. So that means that the EU member states have a stronger impetus to find a way to find a solution in compliance with the international law. And since the UN drug control conventions are also intertwined with that EU law, also a stronger impetus to tackle the issue at the United States, either through a withdrawal or reaccession procedure with a reservation, or the inter-se modification with a group of like-minded countries. And it's high time that should happen. And we trust that Germany and other like-minded European countries that claim to hold international law in high esteem will finally do so. And that was actually the end of my talk. So thank you for your attention, and let's move on.
Thank you, Tom, for talking of so complicated issues in a few minutes, but it's very, very interesting. I think that we have a few minutes now, but I would like to focus on the second part of your speech. I mean, the European regulation and the European level. And I think it would be interesting to say something about the possibility of the European civil society to make an advocacy action on about what you said. And I wonder if Marco Perduca is connected with us. It would be interesting to know something more about the European initiatives on cannabis that is going on. Please, Marco, can you tell us something about that?
Yes, thank you, Susanna. Thank you to all the panelists and the people that are following us. I posted in the chat of today's discussion the link to the website that's called humans.eu, where under the subsection initiatives, you can find the discussions that have been going on for over 3 years now. They actually started in Vienna at the 2019 CND to try and find the best text for a European Citizens Initiative to address some of the, in fact, I agree with you, Susanna, the last part of Tom's presentation. So there are EU common framework on that would not impede the possibility of having personal cultivation, use, and possession of cannabis. And we would like to address those issues because even if without entering into the details, the Italian Constitutional Court has deemed those frameworks in contradiction with the proposal of the referendum that we submitted the other day. So that is the other year. That is the link for this discussion. I would only have to make just one comment in the end. If 1961 is in another century, 2004 is still in another era. After the second UNGAS of 2016, we have had the member states of the United Nations telling us that flexibility and interpretation should be the way to go forward. So as much as we like international law, we have to adapt or adjust to a new world and cultural, social, economic scenario where at least cannabis is no longer considered a drug. It's just a companion of our daily life. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we address these things. The last thing is that, as Constanza has said, the Italians are appealing this decision by the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court is the entity that will have to receive the appeal, so they will say that it's not admissible, it's not receivable. After that, we are now starting to see if before the Strasbourg court there could be any appeal to be made there. If not, we will lose all possible avenues within the UN system, certainly not to question the 3 UN conventions, but how laws can be changed, not necessarily by parliament and government, but also civil society in the country in which there are mechanisms recognized by the constitution to do so, because it's impossible to have a total prohibition also of reform because of something that was drafted 60 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I think, I don't know if there are some questions in the chat. I don't see it. Everyone are asking for a slide and so on. I want to say we have not the slides, but it will be possible to find the recording of this event. I asked to Leonardo where we can find the link to the recording of this of our event. I think in the CND website you can find it in the area of side event. And now you can see some link to documents and something like that in this chat. Tom suggested some interesting link to TNI documentation. And well, I
can share my speaking notes later on my Twitter account at T Blickman, then
okay,
everybody can read it. It's probably not exactly the same as what I said, but
Okay, thank you, but it's great. So I think we've finished our time. I want to thank you all, our speakers, to thank you, Leonardo, for organizing this event, and everyone who followed us. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.